So, folks, welcome back. I'm really excited to be able to introduce to you somebody here who's going to add a huge amount of value to the work that we've done in the first session or two. And that's Rich Fernandez from Search Inside Yourself. Rich, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here, Derek.
And Rich would be too modest to tell you, but he's a pretty impressive background. Now, he's a PhD in psychology, which kind of scares me ever so slightly. He's the former director of executive education and people development for Google, a founder of Wisdom Labs, which is an organization dedicated to creating wiser workplaces that prioritize and instill sustainable resilience and well-being in the people. And now, in the capacity he's talking to us today as the CEO in Search Inside Yourself, who are the leader in the area of mindful leadership education and programs. And you may be aware that Search Inside Yourself is a nonprofit organization that came about as a result of a program that was developed during Rich's time in Google to help Google employees become more mindful at work. And the program became the single most successful program ever in Google, so much so that they donated the intellectual property to this not-for-profit organization and pushed it out to the world. So if you get an opportunity to get to a Search Inside Yourself program, do yourself a favor. It's a life-changing couple of days. But let me introduce, as I say, introduce Rich. And let me ask you first, Rich, how did you come to this work? Everybody in this space has a story. What's yours?
You know, I came to this work very early, much more on a personal level, Derek. For me, I was raised and would go to church on Sundays, but found out that I preferred going to church when there was no mass going on because I enjoyed the stillness and quiet. So I was a child of about 10 or 11 going to a parochial school. And so I would wind up going to church for like 10 or 15 minutes before school started to just kind of be in the quiet space there. That was 10 or 11 years old. Fast forward to university, and I found this thing, someone introduced me to meditation, and it was a game changer for me, to say the least. The ability to sort of like separate myself from my thoughts and see them as separate things, and the ability to just hone my attention and my capacity for focus, for mental clarity. This was a set of tools and skills that I had never been taught up to that point in my education. So I adopted it as a set of personal tools and practices as basically a young man, and I continued exercising these skills, these practices, as we call them, pretty much throughout my schooling, throughout my professional career. Like you said, I studied psychology, got an advanced degree in that, maintained a personal interest in that. But as I entered the workforce, what I found was, and I entered the workforce working at a large bank, JP Chase, in the capacity as an organizational psychologist internally, working on talent, working on leadership development, working on organization development. So as you are probably familiar, banking can be quite a volatile and very demanding and high performance environment. And so I found these tools extremely helpful even then, especially then in these contexts, to just, again, maintain my focus, maintain a certain sort of stability and calmness in the midst of it all. So fast forward then to the financial crisis. Now I'd already sort of launched this career as essentially a learning and leadership development executive, working, at these large banks. Went from JP Chase to Bank of America. Financial crisis hit, right. And this was a particular time, as you may recall, in 2007, 2008, where individuals and organizations really felt tremendous duress. If things were already demanding and complex, this was a multiple of that, because we were all suffering greatly for it. There was attrition, morale was super low, people were, losing retirements and so forth. And so for me, I increasingly drew on my mindfulness practice, my development and cultivation of emotional intelligence skills, to the point where I realized, especially in my field, that I had a duty to then offer that to employees in the organizations I was working. I got recruited over to the West Coast of the United States, to eBay, where I was the head of learning. And I started offering workshops around that time on mindfulness, mindful leadership, for well-being, for sustainable high performance in the midst of all of the chaos and complexity. And they were hugely popular. There were literally hundreds of people coming to these things to acquire tools, basically, which then, as you said in my bio, carried forward. I eventually went over to Google shortly thereafter, and then started really working on the Search Inside Yourself curriculum, offering those to Google employees, again, for the same reason. I'll maybe end by saying, you know, what I found and what is still true today in the work that we do at the Institute is that this offers a set of navigational tools in complex and demanding times that are especially important, not only for individuals, but those who find themselves in leadership roles.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Do you think the fact that you got such a great response in the first instance in JP Morgan and places like that, was that down to the real difficulty, the real adversity in that particular time, or was it just that that material was reaching a point where people were becoming more open to it?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, right? I think that anyone who works today really experiences this kind of this growing demands and complexity, the constant change, the time scarcity, the hyperconnectivity, the level of distraction. Of course, during the financial crisis, that was accelerated, but you know, today we have all of those things in abundance. And so I think the demands of the workplace were necessitating a different solution to help people cope, to help people navigate effectively through that complexity and change. I think that, coupled with a growing body of research, of evidence base around the efficacy of mental training tools, specifically that center around mindfulness and the capacity for these foundational mindfulness skills to build things like emotional intelligence, emotional awareness, emotional competencies. I think that this has really kind of tipped the balance to the point where you know, mindfulness solutions, mindfulness programs and tools are pretty much table stakes, pretty much an essential part of a thriving organization and what they might offer to the members of that organization. It's sort of like, you know, offering people either flexible work arrangements or healthy food choices or, you know, subsidized gym memberships. This is something we know scientifically has real beneficial effect.
Yeah, and it's interesting because not so many years ago, if you go back 6-7 years, if I was dealing with coaching clients or dealing with senior executives, I tended to stay away from the M word. You just mentioned meditation, you didn't mention mindfulness, because people, particularly people in my vintage with my color hair, would think you were a little bit woo-woo and a little bit out there. But now in those circles, in leadership circles, it's been spoken about openly. It's part of the everyday conversation of raising the quality of the workplace.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, there's still some places where it's you know, there's still a little bit of tentativeness around it, but I think it very much is true that there's more of an acceptance of that term. I have to note that when we started this work, let's say 10 years ago at Google, we didn't even call it mindfulness. We called it things like neural self-hacking, right?
To deal with the techies.
To deal with the techies, right? Yeah. This is obviously an organization of engineers, highly analytical, right? Yeah. So we called it neural self-hacking. Through Wisdom Labs, we had offered some mindfulness offerings at Facebook some years ago, and it was still at a stage where we couldn't quite call it mindfulness. So there is a term in engineering called refactoring code. You refactor code essentially to optimize it, to make it the most efficient it can be. So we called it refactoring the brain for optimal performance. And that seemed to draw some interest. I think it is a different day. I think we can use the term mindfulness, just like we can use the term, you know, going for a run or exercising. 50 years ago, if you know, said to someone, "I'm going for a run," they'd say, "Who you're running from?" It wasn't sort of a commonly accepted thing that people just go for a run for the sake of running. So I think exercising mindfulness now is starting to be at the stage where people understand that it's beneficial, or at least are willing to look at the evidence base which again, through our programs, we present.
Hmm. Yeah, and I prefer the first version of your description for all the people who are on this program, that they are actually neural self-hacking, which is super. And for those who are on the call who are dealing with techies, I think it's a wonderful way of just getting that sense across that because it's not inaccurate, you are basically hacking your neural network, And, no, it's. I interviewed somebody a couple of days ago who said to me that emotional intelligence has gotten to the point, that tipping point that employee engagement got to a couple of years ago, where nobody in business really doubts now that there's a connection between emotional intelligence and the results people achieve and the engagement and so on and so forth. So it's just, I guess, making that final linkage between this tool set, which is a great way of putting it, this tool set which enable the creation of a more emotionally intelligent workplace.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, because the fundamental question is, how do you operationalize emotional intelligence?
Yeah.
It's a great idea. It's a great set of sort of outcomes, but what fuels those outcomes? What is the core set of tools, skills, building activities and exercises that will get you there? Our unique approach that we really happened upon is mental training in the form of mindfulness, empathy building, and compassion building equals the outcome of emotional intelligence.
Right. So something else that I've seen you interviewed a couple of times over the years, even before you came on as the CEO of Search Inside Yourself. And I heard you. I mean, people talk all the time about environmental sustainability, but I heard you in a couple of interviews talk a lot about personal and organizational sustainability in this context. What do you mean by that, and how is this material relevant to that?
Yeah, well, I think there's actually a through line between personal, organizational, and societal or global sustainability. So beginning at the personal level, it's the idea of being able to meet the rising complexity and demands in your own life.
Okay.
I think anybody and then to do that on a consistent basis. I think that most people you'd talk to today would say that the level of demands and complexity in their life are rising. But then if you ask them about their capacity to meet those rising demands, they would probably say it's not rising at the same rate.
Yeah.
So we have a gap here, right? So how do you capacity build to meet those rising demands? And it doesn't necessarily mean working more and harder and faster.
Sure.
Velocity is not the solution for complexity, right? The solution for complexity is a unique set of navigational skills that allows you to sort of see much more clearly and effectively and non-reactively what is coming onto your plate, and then to prioritize and effectively navigate those different challenges and demands. The level of information, the level of complexity, the degree of change, that's not going to that's continuing, and it's not going to change, right? Yeah. And so something has to change at the personal level in terms of how we meet that. So we could meet it in kind of this state of high arousal, technically, neuroscientifically, in this sort of limbic state, a reactive state, a sort of fight or flight response to everything that shows up. Or we could meet it in a state that's much more balanced, that draws much more on our executive function to be responsive rather than reactive. This doesn't mean being passive, by the way.
Sure.
But it means, having a certain kind of mind frame that allows for a calm, stable, clear understanding of what's happening, how to prioritize and navigate those things, and how to show up as a leader in doing that set of activities. And then it creates a certain level, I think, of, I like to call it space. It's a kind of vague term, but the notion that you actually can get what needs to get done quickly, effectively, but not necessarily in a rushed and reactive state.
Sure. Yeah, a feeling of space around you, a feeling of some room to maneuver and move in.
Precisely. So that's at the individual level. And if you could obtain that, and by the way, it's not like you kind of reach this state of bliss and calm and then all is good, right? This is kind of an ongoing state of honing that capability. You know, I think, let me draw an analogy, because this might sound, everything I'm talking about might sound a little abstract to folks who are listening. It's kind of like exercise, right? A little bit often goes a long way.
Sure.
So that if you're trying to run a mile, if you could run a mile every once in a while to exercise and do that, great. That'll improve your aerobic capacity. But if you take the stairs, right, and if you do your 10,000 steps a day, if you have a Fitbit, that will also improve your aerobic capacity, right, to then meet any challenging physical demands that come about. So what we're talking about here is a set of mental training skills that will allow you to develop your capacity to meet complexity and demands at an individual level. It is a practice, just like exercise is a practice that needs to be done somewhat consistently. So we emphasize that. But once you are able to harness that, then you can really have this sustainable, at a personal level, the sustainable set of skills to help you meet rising complexity and demands. That then translates when teams and organizations start to engage in that together. That then results in an organizational culture that is still high performing, that still works probably at speed with complexity and with constant change, but yet that is able to effectively experiment and dialogue and meet those goals. A great example, again, to bring it down and ground it to earth level, is what they found at Google through Project Aristotle, which is where they studied what are the qualities that make the most effective teams. Sure. And you may know that the result of that is the number one quality, the overarching factor that distinguished high-performing teams from other teams, is psychological safety.
Sure. Yeah.
Not technical functional competence. That was part of it. That was within the top 5 for sure. You need a threshold level of that. But once you have the competency, how do you move fast? How do you experiment? How do you fail fast and learn, as they say? And how do you trust each other then to pick up and carry on? And so fostering that set of psychological safety skills really draws on that personal sustainability practice around having a calm, clear mental frame, having the ability to be empathic and compassionate with yourself and others, leads to psychological safety, team and organizational effectiveness. And once you have those qualities instilled as part of your organizational culture, it becomes easy then to start to view the world from this place of developing greater empathy, developing greater kind of understanding of the factors that are impacting the world, such as environmental factors.
Yeah, and I think everything you're talking about there is exactly why Search Inside Yourself programs are filling up with so many executives with those challenges. But you said something in there which I think is really critical, because I see them in front of me in Search Inside Yourself programs, and I'm sure in the constituency who's on this program that there are people sitting there and they're worried that, hey, the way I've gotten results in the past is through this frantic, crazy, under pressure style. Will this stuff make me all, as you say, passive and woo-woo? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I would say very simply, it will make you highly responsive rather than reactive.
Yeah.
You'll be able to respond to any challenges rather than react. If react is the only gear you have, that quickly breaks down. It's like going on 5th gear all the time as a solve. Now, will it get you the results you need? Yes, probably in the near term. Yep. But if you carry that over time, chronically, over time, it's not sustainable.
Sure.
And then we suffer for it. The answer to that question is to do this set of skills, things like mindfulness and building empathy and compassion and psychological safety, building emotional intelligence. Do they make me passive? Actually, I think it's quite the opposite. I think they give you greater acuity, the ability to accurately understand what's happening within yourself, your own mental and emotional process, that of others, to then effectively make decisions and take action. So that to me is the definition of responsiveness. Reactiveness is simply just moving through habitual pattern and through kind of this limbic state, this kind of deep state of fight or flight, to get things done. And again, things can get done, but over time they break down.
Yeah, and it's just moving that forward and looking at there's a big wave where pretty much anybody that's anybody in the commercial world has kind of gotten on board with the idea of integrate or bringing mindfulness and mindful emotional intelligence into their organization. And so I am aware, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, of a wave, that's really moving forward much quicker than ever has before. Where do you see that going? Let's say over the next 10 years or 15 years in business. What do you think? What does mindfulness look like in business if you go out 10 years from now?
Yeah, I think I think mindfulness in its current state is largely an offering to individuals within an organization, okay, to help them as individuals and eventually to help the organization. And we know from the outcome data, by the way, in the programs that we run longitudinally over time, we do pre-post 6 months out, for example, after people have experienced our programming. And we know that their level of stress has decreased, their level of anxiety has decreased, their level of productivity has increased, creativity has increased, collaboration has increased. So we know it benefits them at the organizational level, and it's very easy to see how those skills that are beneficial have a through line to organizational performance. So I think where it's going to go eventually is that this will become more a part of organizational cultures, cultures that see the people who are part of those organizations not as expendable resources, okay, but as renewable people that you can renew and kind of reinvigorate and equip to deal with the demands in that organization. I think it's when leaders start to use these tools amongst themselves and with their teams. What would be a practical example of this, for example? Rather than diving into meetings straight away, what would it be like to actually take a moment to pause, sure, and to gather oneself, a mindful moment, let's say in the beginning of meetings, to really understand intention during meetings, intention behind individual and team agendas, to do some reflection beforehand. We don't really integrate that in. What about communicating with mindfulness? What about things like mindful listening, to really understand what a person is saying rather than necessarily reacting or problem solving, but really simply listening for the sake of understanding. These are rather simple hacks. These are very simple things that can be exercised, but currently we don't quite have the vocabulary being brought in yet at the leadership and culture level. I think when that starts to happen, we'll start to see some shifts in the ways of working in organizations.
Right. Right, and you clearly have a clear vision, a clear idea in your mind where this is going at this point in time and where you think it should go, and of course that will develop and morph over time. Search Inside Yourself already put thousands of people through the classic 2-day program, and I know do a lot of in-house programs as well globally. Where is Search Inside Yourself going now with the programs and what you're doing to move industry and business towards that vision that you have?
Absolutely. So yes, you're right. We put tens of thousands of people every year through our foundational programming. But what's really critical for us is now, because we want to scale these tools, is to achieve that through our growing community of certified teachers. Because teachers such as yourself, right, who each have their unique market, each have their unique client base. If you all have the tools to deliver that to the client base, then it will start to be a multiplier effect and spread exponentially. So rather than the institute doing it all itself, we're relying increasingly on our growing network of teachers. By the end of 2018, we'll have over 600 teachers in 40 countries. Wow. And every year, we are continuing to grow our teacher training offerings. And that means, and each teacher training offering has between 80 and 100 teachers getting certified in it. So you can imagine as we kind of ramp that exponentially, we're going to have literally thousands of teachers around the world. That's our aspiration, because that's the only way we're going to address not only the unique regional and markets in which these teachers exist, but also the unique cultural variables. So for example, bringing SIY to China, that might require some unique sort of cultural adjustments, or whatever country you exist in, actually, or region. We want to bring it there. So we're going to rely on our teachers is the answer to that.
Okay, fascinating. Yeah. And just one final thing, coming back to the people who are sitting on this program right now, and I suspect there will be probably a smaller percentage of people who have no experience or no exposure to the material. I think an awful lot of people have come on the program have at least flirted with it. If you were to give somebody who is, just starting to move into integrating mindful practices into their life as a leader, if you were to give them one or two pieces of advice, what would you say to them? What should they be doing? How should they be thinking about that?
Mm-hmm. Well, number one, you said the exact word that I would put as the first priority is think about how this integrates into the flow of your already busy and demanding life.
Yeah.
So this isn't something you have to add or do. You don't have to go away to a mountaintop to do this. There are very easy and practical ways to start to explore this that can take as little as 1 to 2 minutes.
Right.
And I would say start there. Start small. And start to experiment. There's some nice apps around this. There's different ways you can start to explore mindfulness. So start small, start with an integrated approach to this rather than having it be a whole other program of study that requires yet another thing and demands another thing of you in your busy life. And then the second thing is if you get interested in that and it's useful to you, then start to look at kind of the deeper level of practice and development that will help you as a leader bring this in. That might be something like the SIY program. It might be the offering you offer there, Deiric. It might be, other experiences that give you kind of a deeper taste of this, because it is simple but not easy, as they say, to develop mindfulness skills, to experience the mental training exercises. Can be as simple as paying attention to a single thing like your breathing, but then a lot of stuff happens around that. The distractibility, right? The irritability, the stress. How do you distinguish, how do you navigate all of that? This is what happens when you start to deepen practice. How do you work with those variables as they enter the equation? And so what I'd say is start small, start in a way that allows you to integrate it in the flow of your life. Let's say between one meeting and another, if you have 2 minutes, find an app that'll help you do some mindful breathing or some focus training. If this has been useful for you, then look deeper to whatever certified programming or highly reputable experiences that are out there, whether it's through a program like ours, whether it's through kind of a one-day or less mini workshop or retreat kind of experience. This will allow you to explore mindfulness a little bit more deeply.
Great advice. Thank you, Rich. And thank you for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us tremendously. I know it's going to be tremendously motivating for the folks who are attending the program. If you want to find more or out more about the Search Inside Yourself program, it's SIYLI.org. Yep.
Correct. Yeah. And you can just get in touch with us.
Yeah.
Okay.
Super.
Thank you so much.